So I'm honored I'm Cindy Block from here from UW College of Ed Literacy Research Center and Clinic. And by the way, the Literacy Research, I'm pointing to Dana Robertson, who's the director of the Literacy Research Center and Clinic. The Literacy Research Center and Clinic is hosting Pauline's visit here to UW, so I just wanted to make sure to mention that. And I'm honored to introduce Professor Pauline Harris today. Professor Harris is an endowed chair at the University of South Australia. She got her PhD in the US at UC Berkeley in 1989. And across the last decades, she's built a very distinguished, internationally recognized career in early childhood literacy. And so we asked her to talk today, maybe not specifically about her career, but how she engaged her specific career in literacy and literacy research, but more how she went about building a career across time. So that's what we'll be talking about. She'll do a bit of talking, but I know she really likes dialogue, so she'll be interested in talking back and forth with you. I think it's something that helps everyone.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And I just wanted to mention, I can't wait to hear about the beginning part of that title. so Pauline, welcome. We're happy that you're here.
Well, cheers, Cindy. Thank you very much, and thank you to Dana and to the Literacy Research Centre and Clinic for sponsoring my visit here. It's an absolute treat to be here with my colleague, Professor Brock and Dana, and other good folks, and to meet them with all of you, or to meet new colleagues at the same time. Well, flying peas and mashed potato in the meaning of life. Creating a coherent line of scholarship as a university professor. That was the brief I was asked to talk to for today. And I thought it might work best to first of all just geographically situate who this person with the funny accent is. I herald from the land down under, or what we prefer to call the land of Isles in Australia. And just so that geographically situates Australia to where we are right now in the US, that gives you some idea. In terms of Australia, I was born and bred in Sydney on the east coast of New South Wales, and then after I'd finished my doctorate at Berkeley, I took up my first academic appointment about an hour's drive south of Sydney in a regional town on the coast called Wollongong. In 2010, I was approached about an endowed chair at the University of South Australia in a city called Adelaide. And that's where my husband and I now live and work, in South Australia. South Australia's an interesting state. It has sort of middle sibling syndrome because it's the best kept secret in some ways of Australia. It's a beautiful state, but as overseas visitors come to Australia, they will tend to gravitate towards the tropics of Queensland and the east coast of New South Wales, Sydney and Melbourne, possibly over to Perth, which is over here. But this tends to get a little bit overlooked. But I'm very proud to be middle sibling in Australia, part of the middle sibling cohort. What I wanted to do today to address the brief I've been asked to talk to is first of all begin by just talking a little bit about where I began and what I actually did in my research career. I'm not going to get into the detail of the fine substantive issues of my research, but more to track the process that I happened to go through. Now, we all go through different processes and all through different interruptions and disruptions too as we go along in our career, but this is the path that so far I've trod. And after I've done that, I'd like to step back and talk about, well, what are some of the key lessons that I've learned from that? What are some of the key pointers that I might highlight that can be helpful in finding and marking out a coherent research path, noting that things can and indeed do go bump in the night. It's not a smooth course. Okay, flying peas and mashed potato. I was in my second year of school, and I was born and raised a Catholic, so to a Catholic school I went. And on this particular day at school in my catechism lesson, I not only learned about God, but that God was omnipresent, that He was everywhere. And that immediately activated my inquiring mind as to how could that possibly be? Where do I see Him? Where do I find Him? Because catechism lessons were nothing if not very abstract, particularly for a 6-year-old mind. But anyway, I was really ignited by this idea, and I was a curious child. I was very curious, as many children are. So that night, I went home over dinner, I raised this topic with my mother and my father. And we were gathered at the dinner table and we were having crumb cutlets, mashed potato and peas. Therefore, by that definition alone, because I remember the meal, I can also remember the night. It was Tuesday night, because every night was a particular meal in my household. And Sunday was Sunday roast, Monday night was leftover lamb and bubble and squeak, Tuesday was crumb cutlets, mashed potato and flying peas, Wednesday was steak, Thursday was casserole, and Friday was fish, and Saturday was what we called catch as catch can. Whatever you can get in the pantry is yours to eat for the night. It was cook's night off. Well, this particular night, I was really wanting to talk about this awesome thing that I had learned that day. And I was always very animated as a child, talking with my hands and talking with my mouth and really questioning how could this be. And as I was talking, my food started to fly across the table. And my father is really intent on listening. My mother's giggling at the other end of the table because she can see what's happening with the flying piece and mashed potato as my father's giving me a look of consternation to try to rein me in a little bit. But by the time that the peas and mashed potato I had loaded on my fork landed splat in his face, the conversation was quickly brought to an end. And I looked at my mother beseechingly and I said, "But God is everywhere, isn't he?" As if to say, well, he's not here helping me right now. So I was critically thinking about that. Under what circumstances is he there? How do I know he's even there? And of what help is that to me? And so on and so forth. This is not going to be a theological discussion. That's not what I'm here for. But to me, that's my earliest memory of me inquiring into the world about something that I had learned about and was questioning it, reflecting on it, and being quite ignited about the possibilities that that proposition rendered. I would say from my very early years thus began my career of inquiry. And so, as part one, I want to trace a researcher's footsteps. They happen to be my own because that's what I've been asked to talk about. But from that, let's talk about some of the key messages and key learnings that, at least for myself, I've taken on board from that experience thus far. For me, inquiry as a child was always something that ignited my way of engaging with the world. So I would be out in the world and inquiring with an actively curious mind. And that's how I've always thought about children as I've grown into adulthood. That children are active inquiries, they're competent researchers. They inquire, they research in and with and about their worlds. And what I find fascinating in all of that is how children see and imagine and reimagine their worlds. This piece of data comes from a more recent research project of Children's Voices, where we explored children's perspectives of their local community worlds. And I just love the photo of the enabled child on top of a slippery dip and what he was having to say when he was reflecting on the things around his local world that he connected with. I look at the sky and I see shapes in the clouds, babies and horses and dragons and seesaws. It makes me want to climb up trees. I love to get to the clouds so I can see them properly. And for some reason, that really resonates with me as a researcher, to see possibility. And for me, research is an important vehicle, not only for understanding the world, but for change, for transformation, and for seeing and enacting and realising possibilities. And that's what this child is doing, seeing possibility and getting close up to see things properly, to understand. When I was in high school, I loved my English literary studies. I've always been an avid reader from a little person, and if Mum couldn't find me, she knew I was in the treetops in my backyard, lost in a book. So it's not a surprise that I became a literacy academic. It was something that I always loved doing from a very young child. But To Kill a Mockingbird was a standout novel that I studied in my latter high school or secondary school years. And I still have the original version of the novel that I used in high school, and it's marked up to within an inch of its life. Every word, every quote dripped off that page to me. But what particularly struck me were these words. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around it. And I loved how Harper Lee closes the novel, where Scout is escorting Boo Radley back to his house, as I understand it. And then she stands on his porch and recalls the events of the past summer. And it's all told from Boo Radley's point of view as she stands on his porch. And it's one of the most moving things I have read to date, and I still find it very moving, that this child stood in somebody else's shoes and was able to recount what had happened over the past year or whatever it was from another person's point of view. One time, Atticus said, you never really know a man until you stand in his shoes and walk around in them. Just standing on the Radley porch was enough. That really resonates with the line of research I was then to take on, to understand perspective, to understand the perspective of others, to understand that what I might take as a given in the classroom in the name of, let's say, reading instruction, will look very different from various children's points of view. Into my undergraduate studies at the University of Sydney, another seminal work that I came upon in my philosophy of education courses was Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And that was another book that was marked up to within an inch of its life. Paulo Freire's writings about dialogic encounter, about the encounter with people in and about their worlds, to understand, to name, to change the world, or to change people's worlds, their places, was very powerful and very empowering to me. Dialogue, the encounter of people in the world in order to transform the world. So dialogue, perspective, active inquiry, literacy, all started to gel and come together in the foundations of what was to become my research career. In my final year at the University of Sydney, in Australia we have what's called the honours year, which is your final year of an undergraduate degree where you do an honours piece of research and write it up as a thesis. And that then provides a bridge to go directly into a PhD program. So, it's not surprising, given the background I've just shared with you from a very personal point of view, that my research was really focused on first grade children's perceptions of reading and related tasks in their classroom. And during my undergraduate years, I found myself reading the works of people like Jerry Johns and colleagues who were doing just that, wanting to understand what children thought of reading and what they perceived about their reading instruction. But what they had not done at that point in time was to then relate that to the classroom observations of those children they interviewed. So I was really interested to fill in that missing piece of the puzzle. And that's something we do as researchers, is find a significant question, but one that helps to address a compelling gap in the literature. So I engaged in an observational study, and I was really interested in looking at children across different ability groups in reading to understand those groups had their instruction differentiated according to what the teacher perceived to be their reading needs. And I wanted to understand what was the consequences of that differentiation of instruction. And what I found is that instructional choices constructed consistently different reader identities between the ability groups. In the higher ability yellow group, children's reader identities and functioning was nurtured. In the lower ability group, ironically, no, there was a constraint placed on them by virtue of the instructional choices made that were intended to assist these readers but had not quite that desired impact, and so constrained their sense of self-efficacy and functioning as readers. So the implications I drew from that was related to engaging with children as key informants is utterly critical to understanding more fully the consequences of the instructional choices teachers make and how best we might promote learning to read. Okay, I continued that line of inquiry. I got the sense, and what I want to give you here the sense is that where I started, I then didn't change direction. And you might, but for me, that wouldn't have worked. I wanted to build on. The more I researched, the more questions were raised and the more I wanted to understand. So I was beginning to build an ongoing line of inquiry. And so I wanted to continue that line of inquiry when I undertook my doctoral studies at UC Berkeley. And now, because I've got the sense of the influence of instructional choice and the kinds of context provided in classroom for readers, I wanted to drill down much more into the context of the kinds of learning or instructional tasks children are given in their classrooms. And so I drew on the work of Frederick Erickson and Fred Deering to understand the academic and social construction of task and child in the classroom, and particularly at Station 3 where there are particular literacy tasks happening, and the so-called Station 3 in the classroom, and children's construction and reconstruction of the same. And from that research I concluded that there was an immense impact of the academic and social content of literacy tasks, and that the social content of literacy tasks, such as participant structures, roles, relationships, status of who's who in that task, had enormous impact on the choices children made and enacted about their literate identity and their literate functioning. And that was very evidenced in how they interacted with one another and the actions they did with one another as children positioned themselves and other in the reading during the task time. So that just gives you a flavour of how continuing to build upon wanting to understand perspective and wanting to understand perspective in context, and how context shapes perspective and vice versa, and all the implication that has for learning. On the conclusion of my UC Berkeley, on the conclusion of my doctoral studies, I then took up my first academic appointment at the University of Wollongong. And at the outset, I was given a university research startup grant, a very good thing to ask about when you go to apply for university positions. Ask for and ask what is available in terms of a research startup grant or whatever it is. It may be called at particular institutions here in the States, because often universities do make that available. Certainly in Australia they do. So I was given a startup grant, a small grant, that I could continue the line of inquiry that from my doctorate, which I did as a 3-year longitudinal study to further understand the questions and the further questions my dissertation raised, but how that shifted from the first year of schooling through to second grade. In that, one thing that I found there that was particularly compelling is that tracking the children across the 3 years, I got a sense of the connections children build to support and resource their own learning, the connections they make across the different activities and the texts of their classroom and the texts of their own lives, and the discourses of their classroom and the discourses of their lives outside of school. And what really compelled my focus on this was this particular incident where I was observing a young child in a first grade classroom when he was 6, Lenny. And he was reading a levelled reader about families, and there was a family tree, and he was reading the labels on that tree. Father, mother, aunt, uncle, niece. He came to the word nephew. He didn't know the word, so I prompted him and said, that's nephew. And he immediately said, Duckville. I'm thinking he didn't hear me properly, so I said nephew. He said Duckville. I said, no, it's nephew. And then I started to do the decoding thing, and nephew. Yes, and he became a little impatient at that point. He said, no, it's Duckville, and that's like Huey, Dewey, and Louie. So he was making a very cryptic, what to me at first was cryptic, intertextual connection to the text of his life. And at home he watched Donald Duck cartoons and read comic books, etc., etc. But his functioning was very sophisticated in drawing those sorts of connections. And it made me think, how often do we as teachers misunderstand and misread the child and their semantic intentions and what it is they do know that we might otherwise skim over or try to correct. Not my proudest moment, I have to say, but it was a light bulb moment. So I allowed that light bulb to stay on, and that ignited then my line of inquiry into intertextuality. Still sticking with the notion of what children bring in terms of their perspectives and now their capabilities and resources to the classroom, and how that gets negotiated in the classroom. So that led to, ultimately, in building on my startup grant, where I discovered the Duckbill episode, I got some small grants from our Australian Research Council, which then led to my first Category 1 ARC Large, which is a National Competitive Funding grant. So yes, key message there is using small grants to build up to the big grants. And when you get knocked back with a big grant, keep going for your small grants. Because at the end of the day, research is research and money is money. And if it comes from a Category 1 or it comes from a Category 4, as our research dean at my institution says, at the end of the day, it is money to do research, to do good research. So yes, we need to go for the Category 1s, but don't let that stop you, and don't just advise, this is my advice, or the advice I've been given, and use the small grants to build up to the big grant. More about that later. Okay, as I continued this line of inquiry, I got to a point where I thought, okay, by now I've gathered a wealth of understanding in tandem with the literature of other scholars about what it is children are doing and the sense they are making in their classrooms in the name of literacy. And I did that, as I said, in conjunction with my reading of the literature to help keep me informed, keep me updated, keep me challenged, keep me stimulated and provoked. But what I got to the point is, okay, these are children's perspectives, but so what, who cares? What does that mean for policy? To what extent is policy engaging with this body of research? And this was a particularly compelling question because something quite historic was happening in Australia. And that's the other thing, keeping your eye on what's happening on the bigger picture, on the landscape of policy to which your research relates is critical. The year was 2005, and Australia was going through some very dramatic national reforms in the name of teaching of reading. And they had released, the Australian government had commissioned researchers to develop a literature review on effective approaches to reading instruction. And the Teaching Reading Report, as it was called, was released in 2005. The research had drawn on the gold standard of research, that's been called that, quantitative scientific modes of research, in a similar sort of way to the US National Reading Panel, if you will. But what was very interesting in that Teaching Reading Report was the statement about its recommendation for direct instructional approaches that focus on, and I'm quoting, focus on what and not who is being taught. That to me was very provocative because of all that I've been doing in my research that focused very much on who was being taught, and not who was being taught, but who was actively engaging in their own learning. You know, my research positioned child as agent. This research review is positioning child as passive recipient of instruction that hardly warrants consideration when determining what it is you're teaching. So that was a huge provocation for many, many of us literacy educators and researchers in Australia. And so we railed against that. But in the process of wanting to interrogate it, and to interrogate it fairly and objectively, a number of my colleagues and I initiated a research study to critically examine what exactly is the part that research plays in the development of policy. What research messages get attended to? What research gets excluded? Why? Whose research? What research counts? Why? So surprisingly, we put in not surprisingly that we put in for a Category 1 ARC discovery application, but surprisingly the government who had authored the teaching reading report gave us the money to do just that. So I thought that was really interesting, that we need to understand the relationships between research policy and practice, and to understand how those relationships work and how indeed they might even be strengthened. That research then led into a second successful ARC discovery application where the year now is 2008, and Australia is introducing its first national curriculum across a number of subjects, including English. So that became a vehicle for further interrogating this nexus in terms of what informed and how was developed the Australian curriculum in English. And that's a piece of research we have since finished up on. Now, I hope you can see the way that the inquiry built. And it built from something really tiny, well, I'd say a flying pea in my father's face, but but stayed in tune with relevant research and what the research literature is saying, and staying in tune with policy and the policy landscape. At the end of 2009, I was approached by the University of South Australia inviting me to apply for the Endowed Early Childhood Research Chair in the name of Lillian de Lissa. Lillian de Lissa was a world-renowned early childhood educator. She started out in Australia. She started out in Sydney and was very disturbed about the poverty in which many children were living, such as in the slums of our inner city suburbs like Woolloomooloo. And so she founded Australia's first free kindergartens to give children and their families access to free preschool education. She came to Adelaide and did likewise before then going on to England, where she collaborated with Maria Montessori. So I took up this position. I applied for the position. It was a competitive process. I won the position, and so John and I, my husband, made the trek across the Hay Plains, the US Midwest, from Sydney to Adelaide. The position is a shared position between the University of South Australia and the South Australian Department for Education, located in downtown Adelaide. And the objective of the chair is to build research capacity and to develop and provide and facilitate research-based professional learning and collaborative research projects that continue to inform early childhood policy and practice in the state of South Australia and further afield. The first research, would you believe this? Having travelled the path I'd travelled so far, I was approached within my first weeks there about the Children's Voices project. The state government was wanting to engage with young children to help inform their review of their state strategic plan. And they approached me to help advise them on how best and most authentically they could do that work with young children to understand children's perspectives of their local communities and what they wished for in their local communities as they looked into the future. So I felt I'd come full circle. I was coming back to engaging once again directly with young children's perspectives and voices. Except this time, the world of research had moved on to be able to acknowledge the child as an active, competent citizen, which back when I was doing my honours research was not something that had been thought of. And that very much grew out of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child of 1989, that including Article 12 that assured children's right to be able to input on views that help inform decisions affecting their lives. And it came out of the new sociology of early childhood in the 2000s and the notion of child as active citizen from birth. So a bit of reframing then was being done. We needed to reframe children, seeing and making visible the competent child and mobilising and letting the child's agency do its work as they shared through multimodal means the views of their worlds and what they hoped for in their future communities. That was about understanding the child's perspective by seeing through their eyes and engaging in dialogue. And that's where my work with and engagement with Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed came back into its own. Where Freire had talked about authentic dialogue with adults, how could we take those principles and apply them to young children? So going back, and I find that's really helpful as a researcher to go back to where you've come from, to look at what is the cultural capital you've developed as researchers that you can build on to bring to a new project. Not so much as a recycling, but in terms of what's the cultural capital you have. Just because it's a new project doesn't mean you then put to the back everything before that you've read, even if it goes back a long time to your early undergraduate days, for example. So we just had to flip through that. So these are the principles we took out of Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed for authentic dialogic encounter, as he calls it, in terms of ensuring that how we are engaging with children is not lip service consultancy, but authentic, appropriate dialogue over time and in settings that make sense and are comfortable to children and are familiar with trusted adults and others, through languages and modes of expression such as drama, painting, drama, dance, music, song, that the children have competence in, as well as the spoken and written word. The engagement makes sense to children, and that as adults and educators we engage deeply and visibly to children in situations where children's own agency is mobilised and children are included and not just the loudest voices are heard. But then as educators and as adults listening, we are documenting children's points of view in trustworthy ways that have genuine consequence. They then get listened to and they get taken seriously, and perhaps even some of those messages then get taken up and enacted into policy and practice as is seen fit, but with the feedback loop always going back to children. This work we did with the educators with whom the children were engaged in their preschool setting, so we weren't strangers coming in, plus with 350 children across a number of different regions that would not have been possible. So the dialogic encounter, all those principles bound by relationships in a context of ethics of care and commitment. So that's an example of how, as a researcher, I operationalised something that had been really important to me, really resonated with me for good and clearly rationalised reasoning, to a new research context, building on where I had been. Does it all make a difference? It's a question we have to ask ourselves as researchers. We're not doing research for research's sake or just to get the university quantum going. For me, research has to be able to make a difference. It has to have impact. It has to bring benefit. And this body of research, which was done in collaboration with departmental colleagues and with educators and with children and their families, this wasn't work I did on my own by any stretch. Eventually, it has led to the development of Child-Friendly South Australia, where South Australia's been building a network of child-friendly communities that are so accredited within UNICEF's framework of child-friendly cities. And there's been uptake of that work in our local government jurisdictions and incorporation of children's voice in the department's own work plans. So that work has been taken up and is continuing to progress forward. The work around dialogic encounter and children's voice, then, and now we've got serendipity. I worked with a colleague who was wanting to, and I was working in a school that had connections with the Republic island nation of Fiji in the Pacific Ocean. And there had been identified through the colleagues who were connected with colleagues in Fiji, the desire within Fiji to develop community approaches, family literacy approaches, to helping support and foster preschool children's literacy in their home and community settings. And this was a project I was approached to lead. So sometimes as a researcher, you'll be asked, right, to lead things. Some of it you'll initiate, some of it you'll be asked. Are you interested in this? Always do try to find a way to say yes if it does make sense to you and if you feel that it's something that is really worthwhile for you to do, but is also worthwhile in terms of the bigger picture. This was certainly something I said yes to. But again, I had to think, okay, what are the resources we all bring together? Who's on the research team? What are we all bringing to that? Well, we have our wonderful Professor Cynthia Brock on the research team, so whoa, we're not going to go wrong. And plus a range of colleagues from our University of South Australia team, partners, community mentors, and an external reference group. The community mentors were particularly important for advising our research processes. So that work led to the development, the co-construction of literacy strategies in the community settings. Again, building on and further developing authentic dialogic encounters. So again, building on what we had done and what I had done so far with dialogic encounter in that Freudian sense, and now bringing that to a very culturally different place, and in fact 3 culturally different places in Fiji in terms of each of the communities that we worked in. That research got the attention of the Department for Education in South Australia, with whom I was partnered, and they were very keen and asked me would I now incorporate the work that we did, the nature of that work and the key messaging from that research, would I engage in some research translation? Now, as a researcher, a critical part of what you do is research translation, and that is helping policy, helping practitioners and professionals translate your research into ways that can and will inform their work. So in this case, I was asked to develop some professional learning modules to help inform South Australia's statewide literacy strategy. And there were 2 projects that I have done that in. The Enriching Preschool Literacy Project across South Australia, with a focus on our Indigenous children, the Aboriginal Reading Project. And we framed that through an action research inquiry approach, and I brought dialogic encounter to the professional learning to realise that action inquiry. So during workshops, it wasn't me doing all the talking on them at the moment, but engaging in dialogue with one another. Does it do any good? Again, we have to ask that of ourselves and of our research. Does it do any good? In the words of Sound of Music, does it mean anything? So I was asked to put this body of research that I've outlined, or the last few years of it, not all of it, up to the Australian Research Council, who were doing mandatory research evaluations across our universities and units. And the university asked would I put up what I've come to call the Children's Voices and Citizenship Research Program for evaluation on behalf of education, our education unit, University of South Australia. Nervously I said, okay, but that's the nerve-wracking thing, because the rating that my School of Education would get would be resting on this research program that I've led, with loads and loads of colleagues. It's a collective work, it's not just my own individual work. The good news is that it got the highest rating possible, and the good news is I'm glad I rose to that challenge, because I learned the value, and this is something else we need to do as researchers. As you plan your research and as you go along, build in mechanisms for being able to monitor the impact and the benefit your research is bringing. Build in means for being able to monitor the difference your research is making, whether during or after the research. And when you're asking for research funding, and depending on the rules of your funding agencies, ask for funding support to do that. You know why? Because in the Fiji project, that came from a funding scheme in which we were going to be asking for a second grant of the same type to do a lot more follow-up to see the more durable impact of the study. And it was funded by the national government's Australian Aid research grant scheme. We had a change of government. That grant got abolished. That's one of the things that went bump in the night. And so we could not follow up the research. So we've been doing it through other means, but not in the way we'd originally intended. So be really sure you build in. Because more and more, and I understand it's an international trend and not just an Australian trend, more and more we are being held up to how we are engaging in research translation with people in our respective fields, and more we're being asked to document the impact and the benefit. And that can be done quantitatively, and it can be done through testimonial data and a range of other types of evaluation exercises as well. Okay, where to next? Well, where to next is we're now working in the space of cultural dialogic pedagogy for literacy and citizenship education, building international collaboration. So life's going on, it never stops, and it keeps us all very excited. But one of the key pointers here, I've highlighted a few key pointers as I've gone along, but let's summarise what those key pointers are now. People. In my experience, people are the single most important thing that can make or break the way you feel about yourself as a researcher and the good you do as a researcher. Find colleagues that you can work with. When you're first starting out, seek mentoring. When you're midway through your career, seek mentoring. When you're a senior in your career, keep seeking out your mentoring. And it may be colleagues mentoring each other. But find the trusted colleagues with whom you can seek mentoring advice from. It's really critical. When I started out as an academic, there was no mentoring in my institution. I think universities in my country have got better at that. And now our early career researchers and new appointments are, there are mentoring programs for them. So again, if you're applying for positions, find out what's available. If you're already in an institution, not sure about that, ask the question. Collaborators, leaders, and serendipity are really important there. And why I put serendipity there. There was a reason why I put serendipity there. And I think it might have been in relation to our colleague Cindy here, who after we started the Fiji project, joined us at the School of Education. And we found we had so much in common, so much research synergy, and that came to bear on the Fiji project that Cindy was able to join our project. And that was serendipitous that there she was and brought value to the research project. But collaborate with people you get along with, have synergy with, and who share the workload with you. No freeloading. I've been there and done that with some colleagues, and there are rules about that. So be very careful, but also be sure you're making a contribution as well. Connecting with people will help you find money and source grants. Sure, go for your nationally competitive Category 1 funds. Also, seek out information about your philanthropic bonds and foundations grants. Universities will usually have advisors that work in both of these areas of research funding. And don't be afraid to go for the smaller funds. It may not be as prestigious, but will give you money if you're successful to get on with the research that can then build your track record and you can publish from to then better position yourself for nationally competitive funding. In our country, we get big Category 1 ARC grants. If you're a near miss, you get rolled over to a small grant, which happened in my first instance of going for a Category 1. I was a near miss, I got rolled over to a small grant, did a slice of the research I'd asked for, money for, built a bit of a track record with my colleagues on that grant, went again for the same Category 1 research project, finally tuned, revised, and then was successful. So never say die. Writing. What I haven't really talked about is the publishing that you do along the way. Be sure you quarantine time for your writing. In my previous university, I was able to quarantine 1 day a week, and I was a very busy teaching academic at the time. I had a very heavy teaching load, and first starting out, you're creating new courses and new subjects. So it's intense, it's full on. So quarantining time, however so that works for you, And being consistent with that is really important. And don't make excuses. Don't make excuses about the email. Turn your email off. People will live without you for one day or for one morning. You know, we're not indispensable. The email has increased the pace of work, and it's increased the rate of expectation at which we're, the rate at which we're expected to respond to email. And I have found that I've really had to be very firm with myself that on a writing day or whatever time I have quarantine, during that time, the email's switched off. And if it's not switched off, the notification dinnerling thing goes down. It's muted. So you're not being distracted and you're not being tempted to look into it. Publish well, publish often, and be brave. I think that's where I want to say. I think that's where my serendipity might have been better put. Just let me go forward one bit. Oh, yes. That's fine. Okay. Strategically plan how you will disseminate your research according to your audience types, purposes, and scope of reach. It's all about translation of research, whether it's for your fellow academic colleagues in terms of new knowledge, or it's for a policy audience or a practitioner audience. Oops. For example, from our Fiji project, and Cindy can testify to that, she's been a great contributor to this body of work. We so far have a book in the works with Springer that reports the whole project. We've published and have in progress a range of book chapters and journal articles. They are your traditional academic outputs, but we've also written a number of research reports and policy briefs to the Australian government who funded the project, and to the Fiji government and the Ministry of Education there. Keynotes and conference presentations, as well as professional learning workshops. We have given many of those to reach the profession of one of the key learnings here. Community workshops with the parents and communities in which we engage with in Fiji to distill the key messages for families about supporting their children's literacy. And we have a resource package also in progress for the profession and for communities. So looking at that in a range of ways to go beyond your traditional academic outputs to reach a range of audiences and to see how you, once you've written one piece, how you can spin it in a different way for a different audience. It's not a recycling, it's not a cheating thing, but spinning it for a particular audience. What's that audience needing to know? Things go bump in the night, and the two biggest things that I can think of are going bump in the night apart from life happening and, your own personal life and changes that happen therein, which are significant. In terms on the work front, grant refusals and manuscript rejections. For every grant you put in, you'll be refused some. So that's life and that's reality. Keep writing and reading as a team. Cindy and Andrew Peterson and Louise Phillips and myself, all professors in early years literacy and citizenship education, put in an ARC discovery last year and we got rejected. Well, we didn't get rejected, we just didn't get the funding. It happens. It happens, but what we have been doing is continuing to write and read as a team on that topic, and we have a book chapter coming out, edited by Michael Apple and Stuart Riddle. It's a prestigious publication, and we have that there. We are going to go again with that grant application. I think we have a spike next week scheduled to do that. So keep doing it and keep honing your thinking and take on board the feedback as you see fit. Same with manuscript rejections. Eventually find a home. I remember working with my advisor, Professor Robert Riddell at Berkeley, and he introduced me to manuscripts work, and we wrote a manuscript together. And he said two things: when you write together, check your ego at the door. Be honest with one another and don't get too precious about your words and don't get too fearful. And the second thing, even as we were writing, and he said, oh, well, if it gets rejected, we'll find another home for it. So being optimistic and realistic at the same time. Work with enlightened editors where you can. Going back to the intertextuality research, my colleagues and I presented a paper to the Research and Teaching of English journal. And it got a really thorough review, a really thorough workout, major revisions. But the editors could have rejected it, and had it been a different journal or different editors, they well might have, but they didn't. They mapped out all the revisions that are longer than they wanted. They said, we realise we're asking a lot, but we believe these are necessary so that your paper, and these are almost their exact words, can earn the archival status it deserves. To me, that's an enlightened editor. An editor that really wants to help their authors. So we did all that. It took a long time, but we did the work, resubmitted it, it got accepted, and within the following year I got an email I almost deleted because it had a nondescript subject heading. I don't know what it was, but I thought it was junk mail. Be careful about that with your email. But I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't, because the email informed me that that article had won the Alan C. Purvis Award for the journal. So I'm thinking, wow. So be careful about that. But that, I think, is all thanks to enlightened editors. So if you can find enlightened editors, good luck to you for that. Personal qualities really help you. Staying through it all. Resilience. Don't take rejection personally. Kick the table if you want to. Don't start your toe. Vent. Because sometimes the reviews you get can be nasty. And they can, but they're not personal. And sometimes the nastier they are, the more it's a reflection on the person writing them. But take from it what you will about constructive commentary on your work. Persevere. Keep your work life in balance. My advisor, Robert Riddell, always said, look after your personal life, you can give too much away to the job. So be careful about that. I also found myself through the years going to time management and assertive communication workshops to help me along my way to manage all the complex demands on my time with my teaching and my research and life generally. And also assertive communication, especially when I had some tricky colleagues that I was dealing with and collaborating with. All that helps. So look at the professional learning opportunities that are academic but also might be things to do with your workplace skills. Camaraderie, find the colleagues you get along really well with, and laugh well, laugh often. In closing, I just like to say, from little things, big things do grow. So keep your eye on, the footprint that you are marking out in the sand. Look back to where you've been and harness the resources you've been developing along the way, and even revisit some that you had a little while ago and may have just put to one side. From little things, big things do grow, even from flying peas and mashed potatoes. Are there any questions you'd like to ask in a little bit of time? Are there any questions or comments you'd like to make?
I guess you talked about the through line. I guess one thing you didn't necessarily talk about were the distracting threads that come off of those through lines. How do you manage plethora of inspiration from single ideas? How do you choose the branches to follow, or how have you done that?
Well, I suppose I have actually had different distractions come my way. I always ask myself, how best can I build on what I've done? But that comes down to me as a person. So I think personality comes into all of this as well. I was just saying to Cindy the other day, this sounds like a tangent, but it isn't. We're co-writing a book chapter with Judith Green and Doug Banniker. And Cindy and I are both coming at this. Cindy is doing a lot of reading, and I'm reading narrowly and then starting to write, and then reading a bit more and starting to write. Because my problem when I start to read and start to do a big splatter reading, that's when I get all that distraction thing happening, and then my head goes into a spin. So what I find is I operate in a way that's most conducive to myself, as Cindy does, and as you need to do as well. With those distractions, I keep a notebook of all those things. It's a notebook on my computer. And, I'm always looking for the connections. So what might be a distraction actually might be something that connects with what you're already doing. So see if it does connect and can integrate into, and if it doesn't, keep a note of that. But at the end of the day, you'll need to make some decisions. And you'll need to be tough with yourself about that, because you can't do it all. Because if we stretch ourselves too thinly, we might not achieve what it is we are hoping to be able to achieve. So make judicious choices and think about what element of these threads do I next want to weave into my research tapestry? What will help me continue to weave the bigger picture of what I'm wanting to present here and to explore here and understand further? It's a vague answer in some way, but I can't really be more specific than that. They're choices you have to make. But the other thing I would say to you is that you need to sometimes make your research choices in tandem with what are the key priorities out there and in tandem with what the policy landscape is if you're wanting your research to articulate with an informed policy or informed practice. Whatever those bigger stakeholder considerations are, you might want to make some choices in light of that as well. It's a good question. Any other questions? No? Okay then.
Okay.